Network to the world. Subscribe now to the Hot 97 YouTube channel. It's Ebro in the Morning with Laura Stylez and Rosenberg.
Ladies and gentlemen, Ebro, Laura, and Rosenberg back on the program. Our friend Patrisse Cullors, give it up one time. What's happening? How are you?
I'm doing well. It's so good to see y'all. I've been coming on the show now since my first book, which was in 2018, and I feel like your family.
Well, we feel the same about you, which is why we keep having you back on, because if we didn't like you, we'd be like, we good. We don't have to do this. But this conversation is very important. The book's coming out January 25th, and it's called An Abolitionist Handbook. It breaks down abolition in the simplest terms and shares with readers how the use of abolition as a form of self and collective care. Can you give us, let's dig into that, because obviously most people learned about abolition with regard to slavery in this country. But, you know, it's in more of its more specific terms, an abolitionist today would be working on what exactly?
It's a great question. And I do need to say that, you know, we come from a long lineage, abolitionist, of folks who have been thinking about how we deal with accountability, not from a place of punishment. And our dear elder and friend and mentor Angela Davis, actually, I would say, is the person who really launched the new modern day abolitionist movement. And, you know, much of her work has really challenged our idea of using cages as a way to deal with social ills. And so in the simplest terms, a modern day abolitionist is trying to get rid of police, prisons, jail system, courts, surveillance, and detention centers. But I want to say that it's more than that. Modern day abolitionists are trying to dream big. We're trying to dream of a world where everybody gets their needs met, and we don't end up punishing people for oftentimes people having mental illness, drug addiction, and things like that.
Well, I think it's, you know, important too, because there's this adverse reaction that too many people have when they hear about abolishing jails or abolishing police or abolishing these things, because they have not been raised, and by raised I mean programmed, to even be able to think beyond just getting rid of people because they don't fit neatly into society's expectations.
That's right.
Or because, and as you talked about, like mental health or economic situations or whatever those situations are that create an atmosphere for a human being to not be able to cope with what society has done to them.
That's right.
And so we throw them away,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so the process of getting to this big idea and this big dream that you mentioned Angela Davis has, and the one you are writing in this book about more purposefully and specifically, is a journey and a work. It's not happening tomorrow.
Right. It's not like one bill you're fighting to change. This is a.
But I think there's a big misunderstanding, right? Because even going back to when activists were saying defund the police, people thought it was going to happen the next week. Like it was just like tomorrow we're yanking all of the money without a plan and without any support systems or anything that's going to help us deal with the damage that has been done to human beings by this country's practices.
So can I ask you, Patrisse, what do you say? So obviously, you know, you're in addition to being an amazing person fighting for the cause, you're also a fancy, successful person who meets with cool, fancy people. I'm sure you're at dinner parties where people are sipping a
nice beverage,
a Merlot, and they're chatting, and they go, so Patrisse, tell us about the abolition. How would that work? I mean, where would people go? Like, what's your basic sort of answer when people ask you about what it is that you want to see happen?
So I think exactly like Ebro was saying, and, you know, I really appreciate this question because it's a question we get all the time. There is a process, and I call it the Abolitionist Journey. So one, I think the false idea that we can't have abolitionist policy is a big problem. As you remember with the defund movement, and for me and many of us as abolitionists, defund is just our route towards abolition. Defund is an abolition, but it was really upsetting and challenging when our former president, Obama, went on, on social media and said, defund is not the way, right? Essentially, totally after 20 million people were in the streets and, folks were saying defund, it was almost, simultaneously where he was saying, stop saying defund, it's not going to happen. It's not, we can't do policy around defund. That's not true. We could totally do policy around abolition. And that process looks like a couple things. Number one, let's look at our budgets, right? Let's look at our police budgets. Let's look at our jail and prison budgets. And let's see where we can actually cut. Do we need all that money for policing and imprisonment? No. Where does that money need to go? So I'm going to just take the city I live in because it's where I've done most of my work and where I fought. For a decade, we fought to stop 2 $3.5 billion jails. And so many people had the same questions that you hit me with, Rosenberg. What are we going to do? And what happens? And, how do we do this thing? And what we kept saying to people is, we have $3.5 billion. Just reinvest it into the community. We need more clinics. We need more green space. And it took a decade for elected officials to finally be brave enough to say, you know what, you're right. We can't invest in this jail. We need to invest in the community. And so that's one phase of what we can be doing, is investing back into the community and creating more space for people who are houseless, who have severe mental illness, who are impacted by drug use. There are so many ways that we can create new institutions to take care of people so they're on their road to health and recovery.
I want to point out, too, for the audience, we have a lot of people on this program, but there's a lot of people we don't have on this program. And I want to point out that if you look at the pattern of the people that we try to talk to on this program, it's people who are trying to do things differently than the way we've been doing them that got us to this point. Mm-hmm. I think no matter where you are on the political spectrum, and no matter how you feel about society, the point we are at in American society is not good. Right?
I think most people feel that way.
So to look behind us and try to do more of the same would be the definition of insanity. Right? To look forward and invite people in that have new ideas and big dreams and believe and are hopeful that American society can become something better, different, more thoughtful, I think are the people that we need to embrace. And I think that's a problem that people have wrapping their brain around that piece.
I just think what's hard for me, Patrisse, is, and like I am, I was sort of politically molded by an incredible pacifist named Coleman McCarthy. And Coleman spoke constantly about the prison system and constantly in the same sort of breath, because he's a true pacifist, about the war system in this country and how much we spend on defense versus all of the other countries that are supposedly our biggest enemies around the world. So it's also the hard part for me, Patrisse, and this is why I admire you so much. It's so we can't even get these people to admit that we need fair voting practices for Black people.
That's right.
Right? How? And even the people who aren't that bad, right? Even the people who aren't wearing red hats, trying to convince them to even care, right? Because they may not be bad.
Coming off MLK Day, that's who Barton talked about were the biggest problem.
So getting those people to say, yeah, I guess when I think about it, I would like it to be fair for Black people to vote, but I don't care enough to go vote for someone else. How do you get those people to now go further and say, don't worry about jails. Let's create green spaces, which to me, I hear you and go, yup, that makes sense. They'll go, what? You don't want jail? You want grass? How do you battle against a populace that feels like that just doesn't see it.
Also, just
Yeah.
just to add on to what he said, Patrisse, I
Yes.
feel like a lot of people go into panic mode when anytime anybody says abolish anything,
Yes.
right?
Oh, yeah.
Like to your point, wait, no jail. So what's going to happen with the real criminals? What
Yeah.
about the rapists and the child
Right.
molesters? You're just going to
Yeah.
let them run free? People go into panic mode quick.
Immediately. That's the first place they
Yes.
It's the first place. Yeah. It's like purge in their eyes.
go.
Right,
Well,
right.
I want to address something that you said earlier, Ebro, and then address the other things. But one, I want to make it really clear. Not only am I hopeful, and have like this belief system, but I've been a community organizer for 20 years, and I don't want to brag, but I've never lost a campaign. So there's also effectiveness in this strategy of building an abolitionist framework. There's an efficacy to it,
Right.
and it actually changes lives. And then I think this question around how do you convince the people who can't even get us voting rights, I don't think those are the people we're trying to convince. I think what we're trying to do, and it's why I believe so much in the power of local politics. And, if we think about MLK, yes, he fought for voting rights, but he was also a really deeply entrenched local organizer.
Mhm.
He understood the power of local politics. And so when we dive in and challenge our local leaders, which oftentimes you can do more work at the local level, that does impact the national conversation. Will our Congress ever believe in abolition? I don't think so in my lifetime, but hey, lots of things have happened I didn't think would happen. I'm not really interested in the national and trying to convince national leaders. I'm interested in being hyper local focused
Love it.
and using that as a strategy to impact the national conversation. So, that feels really important to me. I'm thinking as a strategist as I enter into these conversations around abolition, and then,
And as a
it is an
pragmatist who
honest-
wants to get things done. Like, that's actually a realistic way to approach it.
That's exactly right. Yes, I want to change conditions, and I know that in the last 20 years, what has Congress changed? And this isn't something that this is not like a Patrisse diss. Many people have asked this throughout the last 100 years.
That's
Congress is a really challenging place. But this question around what do we do with people who cause real harm is a great question. It's a question we should be thinking about more because there are some answers to that. One, there's a concept called transformative justice, which is not retributive justice or punishment based. I think one thing people need to understand is abolition does not mean lack of accountability. In fact, I would argue that abolitionists really believe in real and true accountability. Real and true accountability means the person that caused harm, one, will transform and never cause that harm again, because that's ultimately what we want.
Correct.
If someone causes harm, we don't want them to do it again, and we want them to transform. But also, in an abolitionist framework, we are actually meeting people's needs. People sometimes cause harm and violence because they need to eat, they need to feed their children, they've been abused or harmed.
Hurt people.
And so we're also trying to look at the root of what causes social ills inside of abolition and work on that. One great example in Trieste, Italy. What's Trieste, Italy? It's a small town in Italy, and it's one of the places that has completely decriminalized mental illness. It is not a crime to be mentally ill. They do not lock people up who are mentally ill. Instead, they've created an entire society that has a public health system. Imagine that, where the government is actually taking care of people with mental illness. Folks are not locked away in hospitals. They're not locked away in jails. There's multiple clinics. Folks with mental illness are working at coffee shops. They've really created an entire town that is addressing what happens to people with mental illness. They are the model for the world on how to deal with mental illness. And right now, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, that system is under attack by the right wing.
Yep.
And so we have to, see those models, try to bring them back home, but then we also have to fight for them because, as we know, the right wing is wreaking havoc around the world.
Well, and most of that is tied to money, right? Like it's 100%. The more you can throw people away and put them in institutions, the more you can monetize those institutions. You can monetize the drugs and the things that you give to these individuals. You can monetize, and make money on the people you pay to be militaristic in their approach to dealing with these
it's
individuals.
A very easy sell.
It's a racket.
It's a really easy sell to the public too, because obviously the easy way to think is like, well, hey, if people are potentially dangerous, you have to lock them away.
Well, and I'm glad you said easy, and Patrisse, I'm glad you used the word work earlier, because one of the things that as we go down this path of thinking different over the next generation, right? Because people like Patrisse. Thought leaders like Patrisse and individuals who are putting these ideas out to be consumed and putting them in play in local politics, we're talking about doing work. This isn't just a build a building, put some bars up, and throw people away.
That's right.
As a society, this involves actual work. And you know what Americans really don't like doing?
Yeah.
Work. So there's a cultural change that has to take place amongst all of us.
Yeah.
Right? To either get out of the way and let
That's
people
right.
who are ready to do the work to improve things.
That's right. That's right.
Or get off your hands and get off your ass, learn and do some work.
That's right.
I mean,
Absolutely.
and I know we're oversimplifying, I think, for the sake of trying to digest this new way of thinking, right, and get
Yes.
people on the road to understanding. But it is hard work too, right, Patrisse? Like the reconditioning, the reprogramming of society, individual by individual and community by community, is a heavy undertaking.
Yes. I mean, the biggest reason why I wrote this book was because I felt I'm really worried. I'm really worried about where we're going as a human species. I'm worried about how we relate to each other, how we treat each other. I'm worried about, from the interpersonal dynamics to the larger systemic dynamics. It's can I curse? I
Yeah,
can't
go ahead.
curse.
It's fucked up.
Yeah, it's fucked up. It's a shit show right now. And so, after I wrote the memoir, that memoir was really an intervention. But this is another intervention. It's like, hey, y'all, like, I know you've heard this term. I know it can be really scary. I know that's focused a lot on police and imprisonment. That's partly true. But I'm also really pushing us to build a new culture. For me, abolition is really creating a culture of care. The current culture we live in is a culture of punishment, retribution, revenge. And we see that in all of the dynamics, right? We have to build a new culture in order to build a new world. Institutions are made of people. And many of the institutions, I just read a Teen Vogue article where bosses are begging their workers not to test because they don't want them to test positive, so that they don't want to know if they've tested positive, so they can't, so they don't go
Oh,
to
yeah.
work.
You know how COVID works. No test, no COVID. No
I was
test, no
like-
COVID, no hospital, no death. I mean, what have we been doing this whole
I
time?
know.
Right.
Yo, and these are like young people being brought up in this pandemic where they're being told by their bosses, we don't care about your health. All we care about is this building, this retail system. Like, how devastating, how traumatizing is that? And so I think I'm also really trying to challenge what our understanding of care is. Abolition really calls for a new understanding of care and how we treat one another.
I'd also like to point out another thing that Patrisse, when she talked about local government, she talked about communities. A lot of this also is it's okay to start local and small and individualistic. It's
Yes.
okay to be like, we can't do it. You know what I mean? So for people out there that are scared of this conversation, it ain't all going to happen at once.
No.
It's okay to come along on the journey of learning. And the other thing, too, is as a society, we have to learn what Patrisse is talking about is emotional intelligence.
Yes.
That's the hard part.
Right? And that's one of those starting points where you, like, when you have emotional intelligence, which we're not raised in this society to have, many, especially most men for that matter, is to be aware of your own emotions and someone else's, to understand what they're going through, to be empathetic and care. Like, these are things that our society just does not celebrate. We celebrate, American society celebrates the machine of capitalism, the machine of war, and you know, and the machine of imprisonment.
Well, yeah, that's why, man.
And death.
People love punitive, responses to things like
absolutely.
It's the cops chasing down the bad guy. It's cops and robbers. That's basic.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Well, listen, you are doing the Lord's work, Patrisse. This is awesome stuff. We're excited about this book.
Thank you, team.
Go pick this up, an Abolitionist Handbook. Come on the journey. Do not be afraid. It'll take a generation. We're talking about generational work, by the way.
We are.
And I know in many corporations, because I've been a part of these conversations, corporations are being forced to do this work as well at the highest level, whether you're talking about Apple, Facebook, Google, Amazon. Like, it's happening in workplaces. It should be happening in your communities too. It should be happening in our schools too. Like, it should be happening everywhere, because it's going to take us generations to get to this place where we can be better. If people truly believe we can be better as human beings.
That's exactly right.
You know what I'm saying? Patrisse, we love you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Patrisse.
Thanks,
Love y'all,
Patrisse.
fam. Thank you so much. Enjoy the
Peace.
day.
We'll
You
see you
too.
next time.